There are a few other totalitarian states outside of the Axis powers. And in fact, one we actually side with World War II, which is interesting why we do that. We'll get there in a second. Now, so we talked about the Axis powers. Now, moving forth here, remember in 1919 we have the Bolshevik Revolution, and Vladimir Lenin sets up a communist state of Russia and actually changes the name to the Soviet Union. So Vladimir Lenin is the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. He sets up a communist state, and it is based off the ideas of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx wrote a book that when you go to college you'll read. It's called Communist Manifesto. It's interesting. No, I'm completely lying to you. It's a horrible read. But it is something you need to understand because it does influence many, many people going forth. Okay? So there it is with that. Now, what in essence is the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union, here it is, Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or as it was called, USSR, as we see here. When we get to the end of it, okay, when we get to the end of all of this stuff is part of the Soviet Union. All these little countries here that say SSR, that's Soviet Socialist Republic. What that means is they are a satellite state of Russia. So you have all these countries in Uzbekistan and Turkestan, Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Moldavia, Armenia, Georgia. It's pretty interesting. And in fact, the guy who takes over, Stalin, he was actually born in Georgia. So a little tiny country here becomes in charge of all this, and that's interesting. Now, as happens the case with people, Lenin will die. Now, when Lenin dies, there is a big question over who takes over, and the two men battling is the man don't have listed on here, Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace. And the other man we have is Joseph Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin, again, was not his real name. Stalin is actually Man of Steel, which he borrows from a Russian philosopher by the name of Nietzsche. And Mr. Nietzsche had the idea of the Superman. And so that was what Stalin wanted to be known of, as the Man of Steel. He wanted to have nerves of steel. So Stalin is the totalitarian leader of the Soviet Union. He is different from Lenin, because Lenin had everybody working together, which Stalin did as well. But Stalin, if anyone criticized Stalin, they were sent to what is called the Gulag. And the Gulag is a work camp. Now, this is highly important because he actually set this up before Hitler set up his concentration camps. And so Hitler's actually going to base the concept of his Soviet work camp off the Gulag. And so that's interesting nonetheless. There it is. Now, what is Stalin trying to create? He had something called the 5-year plans, and they took 5 years to get the point. But the 5-year plans were where he was going to convert the Soviet Union into a major industrial power to rival the United States. That is his goal, to rival the United States. And deep down, that's his goal. And really and weirdly and truly, the United States and the Soviet Union team up at this time to take on the greater evil, which will be Hitler. And we'll get into how that works in a minute. Now, there is another totalitarian regime at this time, and that would be what we call the silent agitator, Spain. Spain becomes a fascist country at this time. We had a civil war going on, which is greatly depicted. If you've ever seen Pan's Labyrinth, it's in Spanish. There's a little girl. Her mom is actually... her father's been killed. Her mom's been kind of given over to a general in Franco's army. And she has these horrific nightmares with creatures that she doesn't understand. But they turn out to be her representation of what this Civil War really did to people. And it's interesting, nonetheless, how that works. And in the end, we find out that she does die. And so we see that these civil wars at their heart will destroy civilian lives. I guess it's kind of interesting. So Spain will become a fascist country. They will, however, not participate in World War II. And so on the Civil War, we have two sides. Spain's fighting here, and so Hitler will support the side of the fascist, whereas the United States, England, Russia, and some other countries pump money into the nationalist government that were there. So the man who wins, the fascist dictator, his name is Francisco Franco, and he sets up a fascist, and some people have said a Nazi puppet regime. Some people have said that a lot of things were made in Spain for the fascist regimes of Germany and also Italy. Now, a major painter was here and kind of gave us a thing here, and that would be Pablo Picasso. And if you've ever seen anything by Pablo Picasso, you know it's weird. This is no different. He used what is called cubism. Cubism is where you use different shapes and different representation of things going on. And there's so much in this picture going on here. I'm just going to point out a couple of things very quickly to you, and then we'll move. The first thing, of course, I want to point out is the person who's been decapitated down here, the crying mother over her dead baby, and of course the horse that has been disemboweled. And so what is this talking about? This is called the bombing of Guernica. Guernica is a city in Spain, and the Nazi Luftwaffe, they bombed it, and a lot of civilians were injured. Pablo Picasso painted this, and the idea was to show how bad things were getting over there, okay? Still, the United States doesn't really get involved. We send some help and logistics, etc. Because we were more concerned about another country falling to communism. Remember, we're afraid of the Red Scare at this time, and that country would be China. China is very close to the Soviet Union, and they too are going through a civil war. Their civil war is significantly longer, and what happens here is it is between the communist Reds and the White Army, or nationalists. So for China, there on your notes, you need to know there is a civil war between communists and nationalists. Now, we do send a lot of support to the nationalist leader. His name was Chiang Kai-shek. And so we are trying to help him out. Ultimately, he'll be forced into exile, and we'll talk about that later on, all right? So Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of the nationalist, or the White Army in China. Now, the last thing we're going to do now that we've set the stage on the world is we're going to talk about early on what the United States said was going to happen before we get involved fully and actually declare war in 1941.